Hello, welcome to our first attempt at a little video series. In this lecture, we will cover some terminology about the oceans, things we haven't done yet, around tides and parts of the ocean, and then I will finish up with a quick discussion about upwelling and El Nino. So obviously you can't ask questions, you can raise your hand, but I won't be able to see you and call on you. So if you have questions, write them down. You can find me anytime. We can clear that up, and then we'll also try different versions. So I know in this version you can see the screen, but I'm probably not lit very well. But you can hear me, so we'll see what works best as we go along. But hopefully this is a helpful lecture. We're using the notes that are posted to Veracross, and so you have these slides, and I will make some notes on here as we go along. So the first thing I want to talk about are the tides. And so the main driver of tides around the world is the gravitational force of the sun and the moon. Okay, you've probably heard about tides or seen tides where you have a level of water up against land, and then at certain times that level of water is very high, called a high tide, and at other times it's quite a bit lower, called a low tide. So in this situation, to try and understand what's going on here, we're going to highlight a few areas. So we have in this system, in these diagrams, we have Earth, okay, that's circled in blue there, and then we have our moon and our sun system. So the gravitational force of the moon is the strongest influence on our tides. The sun also has a gravitational influence, but it's not quite as strong as the moon. And so if you want to picture and think about the Earth being surrounded by a layer of water, so think of a layer of water going all the way around the Earth. The gravitational force pulls that water away from the Earth, sort of has it piling up in areas where there's a pull. And so in this situation, we can think about some areas have a thicker layer of water on the Earth, and some areas have a thinner layer of water. And when the sun and the moon and the Earth are in alignment, that is when we have our strongest force on the water. We get this large piling up of water on one end because we've pulled the water in that direction. We have a thinner layer on this side. And as the Earth rotates, you can picture it sort of going under those piles of water. Then it's going to rotate under the deeper water and have high tides, and under the shallower water and have low tides. So this is at its maximal. We have our highest high tides and our lowest low tides in this situation, which is a cool word called syzygy. So with syzygy, the sun, the moon, and the Earth are in alignment, and in those cases we have our largest tides, and those are called our spring tides. So our spring tides are our highest tides. Okay? When the sun here, and the moon here, and the Earth here are in at a 90-degree angle to one another, those are our minimal tides. The water is even more evenly distributed around the Earth. And so those are called neap tides, N-E-A-P. And so our neap tides are times when the sun and the moon are at 90 degrees, and those are our minimal tides. So the high tides aren't very high, and the low tides aren't very low. So we will talk more about tides, sort of moving water, and they're important to ocean systems, obviously. When you have these bulges of water moving across, that is called a tidal wave. And the Earth is moving and interacting with those, and that's how we get the high and the low tides. Okay? So we have our neap tides, our minimal tides. We have our spring tides, our maximal tides, and those are caused by the orientation of the sun and the moon. Other terms that I want to make sure you're familiar with relate to waves. And so with our waves, the highest point of the wave is called the wave crest. The wave then goes down to the lowest point of the wave, called the wave trough. And then we can think about a few measurements about waves related to those things. So the distance between two wave crests is called our wave length. And the height from the trough to the point of the crest is the wave height. Okay? The other interesting thing about waves is waves are actually energy moving through water, and so they're having water go up and down, but in general, the water isn't moving. So if you have an object floating in the water, in theory, it will go up with the wave, down when the trough comes, and continually go around and round, and actually, due to the wave, it's not moving. Because the energy is moving through the water, but the water itself isn't moving. Sometimes you'll have wind or other things that influence and push the water, and as the waves move into shallower water, then the waves will break, and that's where the waves sort of crash forward. They get too high compared to the friction below the water, below the wave, and then it causes that wave to fall over. Okay? So for this, we have our wave crest, our wave trough, wave height, and wave length are things. We'll talk more about waves later, but I thought you should at least know those terms. Okay, a few more terms to understand involve the sort of structure of the ocean. And so in this diagram, I'm just going to kind of outline it here so it's a little more clear. And so that's the surface, and then we go down to the bottom here. Here's the land, down, and then goes along here and flattens out here. So we're just going to cover a few terms first. And so the area of open water away from shore is called the pelagic zone. So this big open deep water is called the pelagic zone. And the area up near the coast is called the neritic zone. And so the shallow area near the continental shelf is called the neritic zone, and the area out in the open is called the pelagic zone. We also have the area along the bottom. So this area along the bottom here is called the benthic zone, Benthic, sometimes referred to as the benthos. So the area that's in contact with the bottom, no matter where you are, is called the benthic zone. And then we have the continental shelf, which then drops down to this, what's called the continental slope. And then when you get down to the flat area, it is called the abyssal plain. So if you've ever heard the word abyss, that's where that comes from. The abyssal plain is down this deep, deep, flat area. Okay? So basic structure, and again, you have this diagram, so you can look at the diagram as I talk you through it. There's also relevance to the parts of the ocean because of how light interacts with water. So it turns out light is absorbed by the water. So light that penetrates into the water only goes certain depths, and different wavelengths go down different depths, and we'll talk more about that later as well. But related to that light, then you should know a few terms. The area where there is sufficient light to fuel photosynthesis, so where there is enough light to fuel photosynthesis, is called the photic zone. And so this is the area where the phytoplankton can get enough light to then undergo photosynthesis and build sugars and do all the work that they need to do. So the photic zone is the area where there is enough light for photosynthesis. The area deeper than that, where the light cannot support photosynthesis, is called the aphotic zone. So in the aphotic zone, there is not enough light for photosynthesis. So when you're in the deep water, that is the aphotic zone. Okay? So we have the different zones of the ocean and the terms that go with that, and then those will impact the different kinds of communities that can live there and the different dynamics with the different features of tides and currents and things like upwelling we're going to talk about in a second. Before I talk about that, I want to remind ourselves of the little creatures living in the water. And so remember we talked about the phytoplankton. These are the planktonic organisms that move along in the water, and they can photosynthesize. But just like plants that you might have in your garden or in pots in your house, these phytoplankton need things, little bits, food called nutrients. And so as we talk about ocean systems, we are going to understand where there are nutrients, kind of the fertilizer available to phytoplankton. When the phytoplankton have enough nutrients and they get enough light, they can photosynthesize. They can then create a community of phytoplankton which can then be fed upon by the zooplankton that we talked about. The zooplankton feed on the phytoplankton, they grow, reproduce, and then they can support and get fed on by little small fish and so on and so forth. We talked about the sort of the trophic chain. Okay? So in these systems, we need nutrients that then fuel the phytoplankton, assuming there's enough light, and then they can be fed on by zooplankton. This whole process is called production. And so oceanic production, the amount of living matter that can be built, depends on the presence of nutrients, the amount of light available, and then the creatures that are there to then feed on one another to then build this. So when we have a lot of nutrients and a lot of light, we can have a lot of production. If we have a lot of light but not many nutrients, then we may not get much production. Okay? And one of the key features that goes on here is in these systems, oftentimes this surface water becomes warm. There's a lot of light, right? But we tend to have low nutrients because the phytoplankton are consuming those nutrients. Because we have this warm layer here, it doesn't mix very well with the area down here, which is cold, but has a lot of nutrients. And remember, because of that thing called the thermocline, we create surface water that might be warm with low nutrients. We have colder water that has a lot of nutrients down here. But if those don't mix, then we can run out of nutrients in the surface water, and that's what's typical in most systems. And so what we need to understand is how do we get more nutrients into those surface waters? And there are two main ways that we get nutrients into the surface waters. One way is called runoff. And so in runoff, nutrients come off the land and flow into the water and then fuel production that way. In some cases, some nutrients are good. They create more productivity, and it can be a healthy situation. But in many cases, especially with human influence and fertilizers, we get a lot of runoff. You get too much runoff. You get too many nutrients, and then you get different algae and phytoplankton that are blooming that can damage the system, and that's what we're seeing in Lake Erie. Okay? The other way we can bring nutrients to the surface is this process called upwelling. And in upwelling, we are bringing deeper water up to the surface, which then brings colder, nutrient-rich water to the surface. And that's what I want to talk about next. Okay, so now let's imagine we have our land here. So we're going to do a cross section. We have our land here, and then we have our water here. And so what happens is the surface water, where it gets a lot of light, tends to be warm, and then the deeper water tends to be cold. We typically have low nutrients in the surface waters, and remember, we typically have high nutrients in the deeper waters, and they're cold. Okay? Now imagine we've got land here, we have the water here. So now picture wind blowing along the land and blowing sort of out of the board toward the camera. Okay, so we have wind blowing this way, and let's say we are in the northern hemisphere. So if the wind is blowing this way, remember the transport of water in the northern hemisphere due to the Coriolis effect is to the right. So what's going to happen is it is going to push water this direction. So water is going to push away from the land due to these winds. As we push water away from the land, what happens is this colder water then gets pulled up toward the surface. And this process of pulling water up toward the surface is called upwelling. Okay, so now we get cold, nutrient-rich water pulled up toward the surface. This warm water is moving across, and so you can imagine with this upwelling bringing these nutrients, now you can get a lot of production in this area. So this is one type of upwelling. Because it has land here, this is called coastal upwelling. And then there's another type of upwelling where if we think of the Earth here, and here's our equator, and we have these trade winds that blow along the equator. Remember, in the north, we get transport of water that way, away from the equator. In the south, so this is the water movement. This is the wind. This is the wind-ish. Okay. Here's the water here. Here's the wind. Here's the wind. The wind is going along the equator. The water pushes 90 degrees to the right in the northern hemisphere, 90 degrees to the left in the southern hemisphere. And so what happens is, as this water moves away, it pulls up colder, deeper water up to the surface to replace the water that moved away, and that is called equatorial upwelling. So we have coastal upwelling and equatorial upwelling. And the reason it's important that you understand upwelling is to start to understand the El Nino. And so I want to talk just briefly about El Nino. I know you've done research on it, and we also have some video animations which you can watch on our class resource page. But I want to try and give you a description of El Nino as well. So if we sort of draw the equator here, we get a little South America drawn here, and we have Peru here. Typically what happens is we have equatorial winds and coastal winds that create upwelling in this area. So what happens is the warm water tends to move along the equator over here toward Japan and in the South Pacific over toward the Asian countries. We get the warm water moving there, and then we get upwelling, and so we end up with this nice area of cold, nutrient-rich water off the coast of Peru. This cold, nutrient-rich water not only creates cold surface water, it also brings these nutrients, and so this is one of the most productive fishery areas in the world. And then we get this setup where we have warm water in the western Pacific, we have cold water in the eastern Pacific, and this is the normal situation. The winds are blowing, creating upwelling. So we get cold eastern Pacific, warm western Pacific, and that's where we, that then sets up some climate issues for the whole world. In an El Nino year, what happens is, good to draw the Peru, South America thing again. In the El Nino year, the winds slow down and upwelling stops. And so what happens is, without that upwelling, this whole area of the South Pacific is warm. So where we used to have one cold zone leading to a warmer zone, we now have warm water all the way across this southern Pacific area. That adds more energy. You got all this warm energy, you get a lot of evaporation, it adds more moisture into the atmosphere. And so this huge area of warm water then changes the weather patterns all across the whole country, and it also shuts down this big fishery in this area that's normally productive. And the El Nino is focused on the southern Pacific, but it actually has an influence all the way up toward the coast of California, which is up here. And so in this whole eastern Pacific area, we have an influence of the El Nino, and it has an impact by warming the water. It stops the upwelling, and so there are large impacts. And your project that is due is taking this understanding of the El Nino and translating it to the impacts that happen in central Ohio related to weather and fisheries that we might get from different parts of the world. So that's a quick overview of El Nino. There's a video uploaded on our class webpage related to that if you have more questions, and then otherwise find me. And that concludes this first video lecture. Thanks.